Hey everyone, this is a piece by Maximilien Rubel titled The French Revolution and the Education of the Young Marx. It starts with a quote. Quote, "You'll certainly fancy, my dear child, that I am very fond of books, because I trouble you with them at so unreasonable a time, but you would be quite mistaken. I am a machine condemned to devour books, and then throw books in a changed form. Then throw the books in a changed form on the dunghill of history." End quote. Marx to his daughter Laura Lafargue on the 11th of April, 1868. The confession quoted above by way of introduction reveals with tragic sincerity the fatal passion of an overly avid reader, unlimited in curiosity certainly, but fully conscious of the demanding finality of the work he had to accomplish, the scientific critique of an international system of social organization, quote, "in which man is a humiliated, enslaved, abandoned, and scornful being," end quote. Marx, 1844. Cultivating poetry and philosophy in a world felt to be unlivable meant becoming an accomplice of those individuals and institutions principally responsible for the barbarity called modern civilization. But to combat this, it was necessary to scour the murky historical horizon issued from a distant past, and where only great social revolutions marked the stages of a progression seen as ambiguous because realized by means of unspeakable phenomena of regression. Only one revolution took place under the contradictory sign of an emancipation with universal ambitions and of a decline with indelible consequences: the French Revolution. Conclusion as well as beginning, it was studied by Marx as a unique event, both in relation to its antecedents and as well as its liberating promises. Although it is true that Marx, quote, "never wrote a history of the Ancien Regime," end quote, a hardly significant remark, it is no less true that Marx studied and compiled, with the eagerness of a schoolboy enthralled by history, an enormous mass of documentation that can, quote, "help understand how the Ancien Regime gave birth to the Revolution," end quote, despite what Francois Furet might think. Wikipedia says Francois Furet lived from 1927 to 1997. Francois Furet was a French historian and president of the Saint-Simon Foundation, best known for his books on the French Revolution. From 1985 to 1997, Furet was a professor of French history at the University of Chicago. Furet was elected to the Académie Française in March 1997, just 3 months before he died in July. And it has a book cited here, Marx et la Révolution Française, which was published in Paris in 1986. I'm going to see if I can find the description of this book. According to the description on Google Books, it says, "Throughout his life, Karl Marx commented on the French Revolution, but never was able to realize his project of a systematic work on this immense event. This book assembles for the first time all that Marx wrote on this subject. Francois Furet provides an extended discussion of Marx's thinking on the Revolution, and Lucien Cavier situates each of the sections, drawn from existing translations as well as previously untranslated material, in its larger historical context." With his early critique of Hegel, Marx started moving towards his fundamental thesis that the state is a product of civil society and that the French Revolution was the triumph of bourgeois society. Fourier's interpretation follows the evolution of this idea and examines the dilemmas it created for Marx as he considered all the faces the new state assumed over the course of the revolution: the Jacobin terror following the constitutional monarchy, Bonaparte's dictatorship following the parliamentary republic. The problem of reconciling Marx's theory with the reality of the revolution's various manifestations is one of the major difficulties Marx contended with throughout his work. The hesitation, the remorse, the contradictions of the resulting analyses offer a glimpse of a great thinker struggling with the constraints of his own system. Marx never did elaborate a theory of an autonomous state, but Marx never stopped wrestling with the challenge to his doctrine posed by late 18th century France, whose changing conditions and successive regimes prompted some of his most intriguing and until now unexplored thought. Back to the text. Moreover, the author of Das Kapital drew from the revolutionary history of France the inspiration for a, quote, poetry of the future, end quote, in which the following vision was designed. Quote, the old bourgeois society, with the old bourgeois society's classes and the old bourgeois society's class antagonism, gave way into an association in which the free development of each individual is the condition for the free development of the whole, end quote. Marx, Communist Manifesto. Footnote: the present article is a shortened version of a work intended for l'étude marxologie entitled Marx, penseur de la Révolution française. I refer also to my work Marx devant le Bonapartisme, published in 1960. The topic proposed in the introduction deals with, quote, Marx, historian of France. Let's look that up. I'm not seeing any descriptions for this book. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for it. Anyway, back to the text and footnote. Section 1, The Trumpet of the Last Judgment. In early October 1843, Marx left his native land, the Prussian Rhineland, for France. Marx moved to Paris, Rue Venue, at that time the Faubourg Saint-Germain, accompanied by his wife, née Jenny von Westphalen. Marx was associated with the former director of the Deutsche Jahrbucher, Dresden, and the Anekdote, Zurich, Arnold Ruge, and persuaded Arnold Ruge to help create the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher, Franco-German yearbooks. It was no longer possible for him to pursue the activity of independent journalist in the Prussia of Friedrich Wilhelm IV. Quote, I can no longer do anything in Germany. Everyone is corrupt, end quote. The suppression of the Rheinische Zeitung, of which Marx had been the editor-in-chief from October 1942 to March 1843, seemed to Marx to be a, quote, progression of political consciousness, end quote. A liberation dispensing Marx from performing, quote, servile tasks, end quote, from fighting with, quote, stick pins instead of clubs, end quote. Marx to Arnold Ruge, 25th of January, 1843. Marx brought with him a number of papers, study materials for various ambitious literary projects that betray the young author's intention to pursue and complete in Paris reflections that had matured during his university years in Bonn and Berlin. Doctor of Philosophy at 23 years of age. In Berlin, Marx associated with the young Hegelians, and in Bonn worked with Bruno Bauer, 9 years his elder and well known for his works of biblical criticism, after having combated as an Orthodox theologian the atheism of David Strauss, author of A Life of Jesus, that had caused scandal. This, quote, doctoral milieu, which saw itself as speaking for liberal thought, welcomed their young colleague with a respect and admiration that is all the more surprising in that nothing yet allowed judging him on his results. But the testimony of some of these associates make it possible to surmise why the personality of the youthful dialectician held such fascination for his elders. This is what Moses Hess, already known for his radical ideas, wrote to his friend, the novelist Bertolt Auerbach. Quote, "You will have the pleasure of meeting a young man who is now one of our friends, even though he lives in Bonn, where he will soon be teaching. ... He is someone who has made a profound impression on me. ... You can expect to meet the greatest and perhaps the only authentic philosopher now alive, who will attract the attention of Germany when he soon is introduced to the public, in his writing as well as from the lectern. In his philosophical bent and education, he goes beyond not only Strauss, but also Feuerbach! Exclamation point. If I could be in Bonn when he gives his logic courses, I would be his most faithful auditor. ... It is only today that I realize just how ignorant I am about true philosophy. ... Dr. Marx is my idol's name, a young man, about 24 years old at the most, who will give the final blow to medieval religion and politics. Dr. Marx combines the most profound philosophical spirit with the most biting irony. Imagine Rousseau, Voltaire, Holbach, Lessing, Heine, and Hegel combined in a single person. I said combined, not assembled by chance, and you have Dr. Marx." End quote. Footnote, Moses Hess to Berthold Auerbach, 2nd of September, 1841. End footnote. One second. Sorry. Bertolt Auerbach lived from 1812 to 1882. Bertolt Auerbach was a German poet and author. Bertolt Auerbach was the founder of the German, quote, tendency novel, in which fiction is used as a means of influencing public opinion on social, political, moral, and religious questions. Back to the text. What might have been the conversations between Marx and his visitor? Hess could not have known the doctoral thesis defended by Marx in April 1841 in absentia at the University of Jena, or Jena. Is that how it is? I thought it was Jena. Yeah, it was Jena. Yeah, Jena University. Sorry, it's spelled with an I here, which is weird. In unpublished work, it dealt with the, quote, difference between the natural philosophy of Democritus and Epicurus, end quote. Marx had left Trier to join Bruno Bauer in Bonn, where Marx hoped to begin a career as a philosophy professor and have his thesis printed. However, the ruin of his friend, who was denounced as a blasphemer by his colleagues of the theology faculty, put an end to this yearning. There remained the possibility of realizing a project, conceived as early as March 1841, to launch a philosophical review, Archives of Atheism. Ludwig Feuerbach was approached to take part in this undertaking. Engels would much later recognize that the essence of Christianity had been the source of general enthusiasm. One second, it's a Feuerbach book. Just want to read the Wikipedia for this book real quick. The Essence of Christianity is a book by Ludwig Feuerbach, first published in 1841. The Essence of Christianity explains Feuerbach's philosophy and critique of religion. The Essence of Christianity is often considered a classic of humanism and the author's magnum opus. Marx and Engels were strongly influenced by the book, although Marx and Engels criticized Feuerbach for Feuerbach's inconsistent espousal of materialism. Feuerbach's theory of alienation would later be used by Marx and Marx's theory of alienation. Max Stirner directed his The Ego and Its Own against Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity. Rather than simply a polemic, Stirner's work uses Feuerbach's idea of God as a human abstraction as the basis for his critique of Feuerbach. Feuerbach's theme was a derivation of Hegel's speculative theology in which the creation remains a part of the creator, while the creator remains greater than the creation. When the student Feuerbach presented his own theory to Professor Hegel, Hegel refused to reply positively to it. Citation needed. In part 1 of The Essence of Christianity, Feuerbach develops what Feuerbach calls the, quote, true or anthropological essence of religion, end quote, treating God and God's various aspects, quote, as a being of the understanding, end quote, quote, as a moral being or law, end quote, quote, as love, end quote, and so on. Feuerbach talks how man is equally a conscious being, more so than God, because man has placed upon God the ability of understanding. Man contemplates many things, and in doing so, man becomes acquainted with man's self. Feuerbach shows that in every aspect, God corresponds to some feature or need of human nature. Quote, if man is to find contentment in God, end quote, he writes, quote, he must find himself in God, end quote. Thus, God is nothing else than man. God is, so to speak, the outward projection of man's inward nature. This projection is dubbed as a chimera by Feuerbach, that God and the idea of a higher being is dependent upon the aspect of benevolence. Feuerbach states that, quote, a God who is not benevolent, who just, not wise, is no God. Feuerbach states that, quote, a God who is not benevolent, not just, not wise, is no God, end quote. And then Feuerbach says that qualities are not suddenly denoted as divine because of their godly association. The qualities themselves are divine, therefore, making God divine, indicating that man is capable of understanding and applying meanings of divinity to religion, and not that religion makes a man divine. The force of this attraction to religion, though, giving divinity to a figure like God, is explained by Feuerbach as God is a being that acts throughout man in all forms. God, quote, is the principle of man's salvation, of man's good dispositions and actions, consequently man's own good principle in nature, end quote. It appeals to man to give qualities to the idol of their religion, because without these qualities, a figure such as God would become merely an object. Its importance would become obsolete. There would no longer be a feeling of an existence for God. Therefore, Feuerbach contends, when man removes all qualities from God, quote, God is no longer anything more to him than a negative being, end quote. Additionally, because man is imaginative, God is given traits and there holds the appeal. God is a part of man through the invention of God. Equally, though, man is repulsed by God because, quote, God alone is the being who acts of himself, end quote. In part 2, Feuerbach discusses, quote, the false or theological essence of religion, and, quote, i.e., the view which regards God as having a separate existence over against man. Hence arise various mistaken beliefs, such as the belief in revelation, which Feuerbach believes not only injures the moral sense, but also, quote, poisons, nay destroys, the divinest feeling in man, the sense of truth, end quote. And the belief in sacraments such as the Lord's Supper, which is to him a piece of religious materialism of which, quote, the necessary consequences are superstition and immorality, end quote. A caustic criticism of Feuerbach was delivered in 1844 by Max Stirner. In his book, The Ego and Its Own, Stirner attacked Feuerbach as inconsistent in his atheism. Back to the text. Engels would much later recognize that the essence of Christianity had been the source of general enthusiasm. Quote, we were all momentarily Feuerbachian, end quote. This intellectual affinity explains Marx's decision to remain for almost a year near to Bauer and to collaborate with Bauer on a pamphlet disguised as a vehement denunciation of Hegel's supposed atheism and Jacobinism. With the title, the ironic title, The Trumpet of the Last Judgment, on Hegel the Atheist and Antichrist, an ultimatum, the two blasphemers, disguised as pious and intransigent defenders of the faith, vehemently attacked Hegel's philosophy of religion. Footnote. Bruno Bauer, Die Posaune des jüngsten Gerichts, über Hegel den Atheist und Antichristen. Ein Ultimatum. One second. Translation of Bauer's Posaune des jüngsten Gerichts über Hegel den Atheisten und Antichristen. An excellent example of the type of writing that characterized the radical school of Hegelianism in the late 1830s and 1840s, in that it mirrors the arguments and irritable temper of both the liberal Hegelians and their conservative opponents during the period between the French Revolution of 1830 and the General Revolutions of 1848. As David McClellan has noted, the trumpet is, quote, the locus classicus for the young Hegelian view of Hegel and a small masterpiece of their style of writing, end quote. As such, the Trumpet of the Last Judgment is an excellent, quote, period piece that can enhance an appreciation of the Hegelian involvement in the theological and philosophical argumentation that characterized the German Vormärz. Back to the text. This, quote, Antichrist would have found in the young Hegelians not adversaries, but on the contrary, allies working together in secret for the demolition of the Christian state. But the most dangerous enemies were the French, conquered by the Holy Alliance, the, quote, people of the Antichrist, end quote, triumphed thanks to the German thinker. Filled with hatred for everything divine, Hegel reinvigorated, quote, the decrees of the infernal convention, end quote. After having vituperated the Hegelian philosophy, denying all external authority to the benefit of the universal principle of interiority, the authors concluded their trial with a pseudo-condemnation in which the delinquent seemed guilty of the supreme crime against the spirit and the faith, glorification of the French Revolution, which he considered the, quote, redemption of humanity and the work in which philosophy has totally revealed philosophy's destiny for universal domination, end quote. Hegel, the quote, ultra-Jacobin, pushed the audacity so far as to see in France, quote, a true Messiah for the people, in the revolution, the true redemption of humanity. Hegel's disciples were unaware of the German character and its epigons, wrongly considering themselves oppressed by governments yielding to all patriotic sentiments, tendencies, and enthusiasms, such as the insane Kupen and the Germanophobe Arnold Ruge. When we realized that the former was at the time the intimate friend of the young pamphleteer, and that the latter was, 2 years later, to become the co-editor in Paris of the Deutsch Französische Jahrbucher, in which Marx was to break definitively and openly with Hegel's political philosophy, the following warning takes on a symbolic value. Quote, who knows if there is not already among them the Kupen and their companions, the Dantons, the Robespierres, and the Marats of tomorrow, end quote. Wikipedia says Karl Friedrich Kupen was a German teacher and political journalist. Kupen was one of the young Hegelians. Back to the text. Many expressions, artfully mixed with remarks borrowed from Hegel, were later to find a place in the writings of Marx, when the targets would be the companions of bygone days, the Bauer brothers, Arnold Ruge, Max Stirner. This was to be the period of, quote, getting even, end quote, more precisely an examination of conscience in which the priority of philosophical studies was to give way to use of knowledge drawn as much from the historical literature as from the study of economists, but nothing that the, quote, young Marx has learned from his contact with the atheist theologian Bruno Bauer, and that he was able to teach him in their shared struggle would be lost or erased after their separation. When Marx attempted to propagate in his own country, by means of first-rate journalism, the liberal accomplishments of the French Revolution, behind the exaggerations demanded by the nature of the text can be recognized the manner of the future analyst and critic of French materialism to understand the, quote, real world, and to interpret the philosophical inspiration of the protagonists of the French Revolution. The fact of seeing in France the chosen land for all decisive social upheavals betrays Marx's political intuitions with regard to the, quote, historical incapacity of the German bourgeoisie to overcome the bonds of Prussian absolutism. Quote, if you have read The Trumpet about Hegel, and if you do not know it yet, I must inform you, but under the seal of secrecy, that it was written by Bauer and Marx. I laughed to tears when I read it, end quote. The author of these remarks, George Jung, a leading figure in the German youth of Cologne, made this revelation to Arnold Ruge after having noted in a preceding letter that Marx, Bauer, and Feuerbach were going to work together to create, quote, a theological political review, end quote, and that, quote, the angels had better project the good Lord, end quote, for, quote, those three will no doubt chase him right out of heaven and even pin a lawsuit on him, end quote. Georg Jung to Arnold Ruge, 18th of October, 1841. Let me see if this person comes up, Georg Jung. I can't find anything good. Back to the text. News of this sensational project had already reached Ruge, who had spoken of it to a friend. Quote, Bruno Bauer, Marx, Christensen, and Feuerbach will shout it on the mountain, or have already done so, and they have made a flag of their atheism and their mortal destiny. God, religion, and immortality have been dethroned. The philosophical republic and the divinity of man have been proclaimed, end quote. A few months later, Bruno Bauer informed Ruge that his, quote, theologian Marx, end quote, his, quote, co-prisoner in Christo, end quote, was still working on the second part of the trumpet. This was the period when, according to a very detailed study of him, the apostate, young Hegelian Bruno Bauer, quote, was fully under the influence of the most radical tendency of the French Revolution, end quote. One second. Sorry, I wanted to see. There's a footnote. Ernest Barnacle, Bruno Bauer, end footnote. And it was also the moment when the young doctor of philosophy seemed to his entourage to be driven by ideas of liberal radicalism, like a thinker capable of resolving the, quote, crisis of philosophy, end quote, by taking the lead among the, quote, new philosophers, end quote, determined to go beyond the idealism of their master philosopher Hegel and to move to the, quote, praxis of the idea, end quote. Footnote, Moses Hess, Gegen Vertige Krisis der deutschen Philosophie, end footnote. The question of the Orient, born in the 1839 Turkish-Egyptian conflict that had culminated in 1841 in a dangerous tension between France and Germany. Wikipedia says the Second Egyptian-Ottoman War lasted from 1839 until 1841 and was fought mainly in Syria. It's been sometimes referred to as the Syrian War or Second Syrian War. In 1839, the Ottoman Empire moved to reoccupy lands lost to Muhammad Ali in the First Turco-Egyptian War. This resulted in the Battle of Nazib, which led to an Ottoman defeat. On the 1st of July, the Ottoman fleet sailed to Alexandria and surrendered to Muhammad Ali. Britain, Austria, and other European nations rushed to intervene and force Egypt into accepting a peace treaty. From September to November 1840, a combined naval fleet made up of British and Austrian vessels cut off Ibrahim's sea communication with Egypt, followed by the occupation of Beirut and Acre by the British. On the 27th of November 1840, the Convention of Alexandria took place. British Admiral Charles Napier reached an agreement with the Egyptian government where the latter abandoned its claims to Syria and returned the Ottoman fleet in exchange of the recognition of Muhammad Ali and his sons as the only legitimate rulers of Egypt. Back to the text. It had proved in both countries a wave of patriotism and led it provoked in both countries a wave of patriotism and led representatives of the intellectual classes to make political professions of faith. In these circumstances of political crisis and crisis of philosophy, but also with the announcement of the definite suspension of Bruno Bauer, recognized as, quote, heretical, by the majority of Bruno Bauer's colleagues as well as by the government, Marx reached his decision to respond publicly to the expectations of his friends and admirers. All hopes of an academic career were now lost for Marx. Marx would apply his talents as writer and polemicist for serving a cause to which he would remain faithful until the end of his life: freedom of conscience. Freedom of conscience. Freedom of conscience. On the 10th of February 1842, Marx sent Arnold Ruge his first essay for the Deutsche Jahrbucher, a liberal profession of faith, the definitive nature of which was confirmed by its republication in 1851, 3 years after the publication of the Communist Manifesto. One second. Footnote. Bemerkungen über die neueste preußische Censorinstruction. Shit, come on. Let's see if there's anything on this article on the internet. Oh, I'm not seeing anything. End footnote. The, quote, remarks about the recent Prussian instruction on censorship, end quote, fall into the tradition of, quote, eternal, end quote, principles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and cannot be understood fully outside the context of the revolutionary history of France from 1789 to 1830 in its alternative phases of promised emancipation and of reactionary reality, the result of philosophical and legal studies, whose breadth can be measured from the notebooks made in preparation for his doctoral thesis and from articles on various subjects: philosophy, history of religion and of art, Hegelian philosophy of law, etc. The, quote, remarks are essentially directed against a, quote, pseudo-liberalism yielding concessions that sacrifice people, the instruments, while preserving the object, institutions, end quote. The insistence with which Marx, in criticizing the, quote, anti-liberalism, end quote, of the Prussian instruction, introduces into Marx's critique of censorship a critique of the Christian state, presents the outlines of his future political theory based on his prior study of the French Revolution. Marx had to suffer censorship decreed by a so-called Christian authority in order to ask himself about the relationship between morality and religion on the one hand, and on the other, between public law and the free exercise of the right of expression. Begun in Prussia, this study was completed in France, where Marx, thanks to new readings noted in his study notebooks, discovered the intimate link between politics and economics, the truly definitive subject of Marx's work. The, quote, remarks were meant to be followed by a, quote, study of Christian art, end quote, as a part of the trumpet. As a second part of the trumpet. The banning of this pseudo-orthodox pamphlet by censorship turned Marx away from this project. In any case, he already had in mind another work for the Anecdota of Ruge, quote, another essay that I had also intended for the Deutsche Jahrbucher, is a critique of Hegel's natural law inasmuch as it concerns internal public law. Essentially, it is a matter of combating the, quote, constitutional monarchy, end quote, as a hybrid being, fundamentally contradictory and implying its own negation. Res publica is completely untranslatable into German, end quote. Marx to Ruge, 5th of March, 1842. Son of a bitch. trying to see if there's anything for this anecdota. I'm not saying anything for it. Excuse me. Back to the text. Without ceasing work on this essay, Marx submitted to the Rheinische Zeitung a series of articles in which he pursued and completed the critique of censorship begun in his, quote, remarks, examining discussions of freedom of the press and publication of the acts of the Sixth Rhineland Diet. This writing abounds in references to the French Revolution and its liberal spirit, manifestly inspired by the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which gives it the nature of an apologetic treatise on the principles and traditions of freedom of expression, as cultivated in countries such as England, Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, and America. As for France, Marx referred to the Charter of 1830 that definitively abolished censorship, while maintaining strictures of the 1817 laws had placed around the press, jury trial for press crimes, greater penalties for offenses against the person of the king, and the dynastic regime, right of temporary suppression, increased bonds. Wikipedia says the Charter of 1830 instigated the July monarchy in France. The Charter of 1830 was considered a compromise between constitutional monarchists and republicans. New section, Section 2, in praise of democracy. In several articles published in the Rheinische Zeitung, Moses Hess had tried to make readers of the newspaper understand that communist ideas responded to a need of the times and deserved to be taken seriously. In France, workers were fully conscious of the goal of their struggle and were turning more and more frequently toward communism. During a scholarly congress in Strasbourg, where participants from numerous European countries had discussed the social situation of underprivileged classes, one topic had been, quote, the class that possesses nothing, end quote, but that now demands its share of the wealth of the middle classes who hold power. Similar to the experience of 1789, when the Third Estate demanded and obtained the privileges of the nobility. The Rheinische Zeitung had reported this discussion, leading the Augsburg newspaper to accuse its rival of having exposed to the public, quote, communism in its unclean nakedness, end quote. However, Marx noted, quote, the prophecy of Sieyès, I can't remember how to pronounce that guy's name. Let's see. Come on. Is it? I believe it's Sieyès.
Sieyès. Sieyès.
Sieyès. However, Marx noted, quote, the prophecy of Sieyès has been fulfilled and the Third Estate has become all and wants to be all, end quote. And it is very clear that the warnings announced today from Strasbourg should not leave the public indifferent. But the problem is, quote, too serious to be solved using oversimplified phraseology, end quote. A problem that, quote, two peoples are attempting to overcome, end quote. France and Germany, as Moses Hess had shown. From now on, Marx's struggle against Prussian censorship was nourished by ideas drawn from Marx's first socialist readings, especially French socialist readings, and by an increasingly critical analysis of Hegel's political philosophy. The government was not long in demanding, under penalty of its being banned, that the Rhineland newspaper change its course, and shareholders were crying for a more moderate tone. At the same time, the conflict with the, quote, franchised, end quote, group led to withdrawal of most of the Berlin employees of the Rheinische Zeitung. In January 1843, the editorial staff received the fatal decision. The Rheinische Zeitung had to cease publication on the 1st of April. Marx, who had refused to bend to the hesitating attitude of the shareholders, offered his resignation and published a formal declaration along those lines. Marx proposed to Ruge that they create the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher in Strasbourg. The many articles that appeared in the Rheinische Zeitung on the revolutions of 1789 and of 1830 had nourished his critical reflection on Hegelian conceptions of the state, orders, and bureaucracy. There exists a highly important autobiographical document from this relatively short period between Marx's resignation from the Rhineland newspaper in March 1843 and his move to Paris in October of the same year. The 1859 preface to the Critique of Political Economy, of which Das Kapital Book 1 would, in 1867, be the continuation. In the biographical sketch that Marx traced for himself, one essential fact is lacking for an understanding of the research that was to lead, in 1843, to the discovery of the, quote, materialist and critical conception of the world, end quote, to use Marx's own terminology devised in the years 1845 to 46. One second. In fact, in addition to the, quote, critical revision of Hegel's philosophy of law, end quote, during the period from March to October 1843, Marx had undertaken major historical studies, especially in the domain of the historiography of the French Revolution. It is even possible to think that his critical dialogue with Hegel, synonymous with a philosophical examination of conscience, shows the effects of certain historical readings from the same period, particularly the reading of Feuerbach's Provisional Theses for the Reform of Philosophy. Of 1843. I'm not seeing any descriptions of this. Apparently it is available in the Young Hegelians, an anthology. Back to the text. Marx's anti-Hegelian critique is not aimed simply at the, quote, mysticism of the master's political philosophy, but also and especially at Hegel's method of transforming, quote, ideas and, quote, concepts into entities endowed with life, into hypostases or, quote, objectified abstractions, end quote. Quote, in a mystical manner, end quote, Hegel made the state into a personified subject, a, quote, moment of mystical substance, end quote. The monarch identified with the sovereignty of the state. Marx raises a dilemma. Quote, either there is sovereignty of the monarch or there is sovereignty of the people. This is the question, end quote. Marx. The critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. This, quote, critical revision, accomplished by Marx in his argument with Hegel in the name of his conception of democracy, clearly reflects the influence of his early readings from historians of the French Revolution. Quote, in a monarchy, everything, even the people, is subsumed under one of its modes of existence, the political constitution. In a democracy, the constitution itself is alone the sole determination. The constitution itself is alone the sole determination, namely the determination of the people by the people's self. In a monarchy, we have the people of the constitution. In a democracy, the constitution of the people. In democracy, the enigma of all constitutions is resolved. In democracy, the enigma of all constitutions is resolved. The Constitution is not only of itself. The Constitution is not only of the Constitution's self, according to the Constitution's essence, but based in the existence, the reality, constantly referred back to the Constitution's real foundation of the real man, the real people, the real man, the real people. And the Constitution is posited as the actual work of this people. And the Constitution is posited as the actual work of this people. End quote, Marx. And again, if I repeat something like I just did a bunch of times there, that means there's italics in in the phrase. This unfinished manuscript, which Marx would later consider a stage on the path that had led Marx to the materialist conception of history, represents an initial attempt at conceiving democracy as the ideal form of all constitutions of state. When Marx enriched his knowledge with the fruits of his historical and economic studies, Marx arrived at a concept in which the state appeared incompatible with the existence of democracy in the real sense of the term. However, the seed of Marx's future, quote, an-archism, end quote, is present in this first idealization. Quote, in comparison with democracy, all other forms of government are like the Old Testament. Man does not exist because of the law, but the law exists in relation to man. Man has a human existence, whereas in other forms, man has legal existence. This is the fundamental distinction of democracy, end quote, Marx. Hegel's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. A true union of the general and the particular, democracy does not tolerate the separation of the political man from the private man. Property, contracts, marriage are not particular institutions existing apart from the political state, since this is but a particular mode of existence of the people. And Marx noted, quote, the French realized that in a true democracy, the political state disappears. The French realized that in a true democracy, the political state disappears. It is true in this sense that as political state, as constitution, it does not hold together, ... In a democracy, the constitution, the law, the state itself, inasmuch as it is a political constitution, is nothing but a determination of the people by the people whose content is determined by the people. End quote. Marx. Critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. This charge against Hegel contains the first elements of the, quote, critique of politics that Marx developed alongside the, quote, critique of economics. Marx's many historical political writings, just like Das Kapital, which remained unfinished, contained what could be called the, quote, prolegomena to a theory of real democracy, end quote. And it is not imprudent to affirm that among works read by Marx, before delving into the historiography of the French Revolution, the study of de Tocqueville in the search for a, quote, image of democracy in America, end quote, profoundly marked the orientation of his critique of Hegel. But it is thanks to the reading of a multitude of French socialist and communist authors that Marx was able to go beyond the aristocratic conceptions of the long-distance traveler who saw in the, quote, democratic revolution, which he thought was happening in America, a future world that was more to be feared than hoped for. Footnote, quote, I confess that in America I saw more than America. I looked in America for an image of democracy itself. I wanted to know democracy, if only to learn at least what we should hope for or fear from democracy. Tocqueville, La démocratie en Amérique. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but... Wikipedia says Democracy in America. It was published in 2 volumes, the first in 1835 and the second in 1840, is a classic French work by Alexis de Tocqueville. In the book, Tocqueville examines the democratic revolution that he believed had been occurring over the previous several hundred years. In 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont were sent by the French government to study the American prison system. In Tocqueville's later letters, Tocqueville indicates that he and Beaumont used their official business as a pretext to study American society instead. They arrived in New York City in May of that year and spent 9 months traveling the United States, studying the prisons and collecting information on American society, including its religious, political, and economic character. Beaumont and Tocqueville also briefly visited Canada, spending a few days in the summer of 1831 in what was then Lower Canada, modern-day Quebec, and Upper Canada, modern-day Ontario. Tocqueville and Beaumont returned to France in February 1832 and submitted their report du système pénitentiaire ou État uni et de son application en France, on the penitentiary system in the United States and its application in France the next year. When the first edition was published, Beaumont was working on another book, Marie ou l'esclavage ou État uni, Mary or Slavery in the United States, published as 2 volumes in 1835, a social critique and novel describing the separation of races in a moral society and the conditions of slaves in the United States. Before finishing Democracy in America, Tocqueville believed that Beaumont's study would prove more comprehensive and penetrating. Back to the text. New section. Historiography of the Great, Section 3, Historiography of the French Revolution. The influence of early readings of historians of the French Revolution can be felt especially in the last and longest part of the 1843 manuscript, in which Marx analyzes Hegelian theses on, quote, legislative power. According to Marx, the Constitution, quote, was not made by itself, end quote, and a legislative power must have preceded the established power, one that remains outside the Constitution, but is subsumed in the Constitution. To achieve this new Constitution, quote, a revolution in the rules has always been necessary, end quote. It is, therefore, historically false to speak of, quote, gradual gradual transition, end quote. For in order to have progress, the true basis of the Constitution, the people must become its principal element. Marx compared European and American institutions like de Tocqueville, who did not seek their roots in legal developments from the French Revolution. By examining the relationship between the Constitution and legislative power in the case when, quote, the political state does not exist other than as formalism of the real state, end quote. And when, quote, the legislative power has an origin other than governmental power, end quote. Marx was able to illustrate his argument, namely Marx's critique of Hegel, through an important historical reminder, quote, it was the legislative power that made the French Revolution. It is legislative power, everywhere legislative power has appeared, in legislative power's particular form, as the predominant factor that has produced the major organic revolutions of universal import. Legislative power fought not against the Constitution, but against a specific anachronous Constitution, precisely because legislative power was representative of the people, of the generic will. Governmental power, on the other hand, has produced only little revolutions, backward revolutions, reactions. It did not revolt in favor of a new constitution over an old one, but against the Constitution precisely because governmental power represented a particular will, arbitrarily subjective, the magic element of the will. Correctly put, the question is simply this: does the people have the right to give itself a new constitution? The response can only be affirmative because as soon as the Constitution ceases to be the real expression of the will of the people, it becomes in fact an illusion, end quote. Marx. Without referring directly to historians of the French Revolution or the other documentary sources of a philosophical or legal nature, time and again throughout Marx's critique of the Hegelian concept of legislative power, Marx uses arguments that animated post-revolutionary literature regarding constitutional and legal problems in societies that had preserved institutions of feudal law, such as corporations, orders, Stände, etc., when popular objections of a general nature arose. And while Marx wrote that, quote, the orders, Stände, are the contradiction placed at the heart of the state between civil society and the state, end quote, Marx added immediately, quote, the orders are at the same time the demand for a solution to this contradiction, end quote. Reproving the scorn with which the philosopher of the state spoke of the, quote, masses, the, quote, rabble, and the, quote, people, Marx defends the, quote, shapeless mass, end quote, whose movement and action could be, quote, elementary, irrational, savage, and terrible, end quote. Marx accepts the separation of civil society from the political state as, quote, two fixed antitheses, in German, Gegensätze, two truly different spheres, end quote. But Marx adds, quote, in truth, this separation really exists in the modern state, end quote. Unlike the Middle Ages when the orders had a political existence because, quote, the order's existence was the existence of the state, end quote. Unlike ancient Greece where civil society was the slave of political society, modern times know the political state in the political state's separation from civil society, just as Hegel had correctly understood, but not without producing a fundamental contradiction. He posited a real separation as a, quote, necessary moment of the idea, end quote, and as the, quote, absolute truth of reason, end quote, by making civil orders the representative element of an identity that, in reality, does not exist. Hegel, quote, forgets that it is a matter of a reflexive relationship, And Hegel makes civil orders as such into political orders, but always in the sense of legislative power, so that their very activity is the proof of separation, end quote. Marx. This, quote, real separation, end quote, constitutes the essential feature of both social relationships and of individual existence in the modern state. And we can understand why Marx, after having acquired a wealth of knowledge about the history of the French Revolution, as well as economics, by 1845 had chosen as theme and title for the principal work of his life, Critique of Politics and of Economics. Footnote: the contract signed on the 1st of February 1845 in Paris with the publisher C.W. Leska of Darmstadt concerned a 2-volume work. This double, quote, critique was at that time only in outline stage. End footnote. Marx's original contribution to a theory of the community liberated from servitudes imposed by the separation opposition of civil society from the state, and hence of the citizen from the private person, apparently existing in the same individual, consisted in having diagnosed the destructive effects of this antagonism, externally and internally. When a few months later, Marx wrote and published the, quote, introduction to this text that had remained in a preliminary state, Marx's thinking was enriched by the fruits of his Kreuznach philosophical readings, the results of which also being evident in The Jewish Question. But it is in the anti-Hegelian manuscript that can be found the epistemological and ethical presuppositions for analyses of the social and moral dichotomy that constitutes the substance of Marx's unfinished work. And the more one reads his commentaries, the more one sees that the influence of purely historical books grows in importance. Quote, it is through historical progress that political orders have been transformed into social orders. It is through historical progress that political orders have been transformed into social orders, so that individual members of the people, like Christians who are equal in heaven and unequal on earth, are equal in heaven of their political universe and unequal in the earthly existence of society. Are equal in heaven of their political universe and unequal in the earthly existence of society. The transformation of such political orders and civil orders took place under an absolute monarchy. Bureaucracy established the idea of unity opposed to different states within the state. However, right alongside the bureaucracy of absolute governmental power, the social difference of orders remained a political difference, and this in the very heart of and alongside this bureaucracy. However, right alongside the bureaucracy of absolute governmental power, the social difference of orders remained a political difference, and this in the very heart of and alongside this bureaucracy. It was only the French Revolution that completed the transformation of political orders into social orders. In other words, it changed the differences in the orders of civil society into purely social differences, into differences of private life lacking in any importance for political life. And so was the separation of political life from civil society complete. End quote. Marx, On the Jewish Question and Towards a Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law. End footnote. Shit, that was actually that's not what it's from. It says Marx from Sur Critique, 1843, so it had been toward a critique of Hegel's philosophy of law. Although neither the term, quote, social class nor, quote, proletariat was used to describe an actual situation, lending itself perfectly to this type of terminology, the logical rigor of this reasoning led Marx to move on from orders to classes and from civil society to the bourgeoisie. Marx amplified and furthered the idea of, quote, separation, so abundantly developed in the unpublished critique of Hegelian, quote, mystification, by adding to it the idea of, quote, negation, or of, quote, struggle. And so the two essays published in Paris in the Deutsch Französische Jahrbucher can also be considered as the logical conclusion of a first period of reflection that culminates with the critical interpretation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Footnote. On Marx on the Jewish question and toward a critique of Hegel's philosophy of law. By contrasting Hegel's, quote, logical mysticism and idealization of the monarchical state with the dichotomy and alienation of real life, civil and political, in the modern constitutional state, Marx was led to seek in the history of the French Revolution arguments going beyond the limits of criticism emanating from the power of the state. This orientation responds logically to the work of criticism of politics and economics, the objective of which had been formally stated in the Parisian Jahrbucher, human emancipation. Thus, it is in light of this ethical postulate that the significance of Marx's historical readings should be judged, particularly Marx's interest in the historiography of the French Revolution. Quote, assuredly, political emancipation represents a great advance. It is certainly not the ultimate form of human emancipation as such, but political emancipation is the latest form of human emancipation within the world order as the world order has existed until now. Let us be clear on this point. We are speaking here of real practical emancipation. It is only when the real individual person has recovered the abstract citizen in himself that as individual person he can become a generic being in his own experience, in his individual work, in his individual relations. It is only when man has recognized and organized his, quote, own powers, end quote, as social powers, and ceases to cut himself off from social power under the guise of political power, it is only then that human emancipation will be accomplished. End quote. Marx. Section 4. The Kreuznach Notebooks, July-August 1843. These are 5 notebooks from 1 to 5, about 260 pages of cramped writing, filled with passages from 23 historical and political works. Their principal subject matter is France, and other subjects include medieval and feudal Germany, England after the Norman Conquest, Sweden and its political and religious institutions from antiquity until the creation of the hereditary empire and the reign of nobility. The revolutionary perspective of the United States of North America under a, quote, accomplished democracy drew the special attention of this gleaner of history to be, quote, consumed productively. Although in July 1843 the French exile had not yet been decided upon, Marx and Ruge must have felt like Heine before Heine's flight to Paris after the July Revolution. Quote, if one simply compares the history of the French Revolution with the history of German philosophy, One is tempted to think that, obliged to attend to so many real tasks in which they absolutely had to remain attentive, the French asked us to sleep and to dream for them, and our German philosophy is nothing other than the dream of the French Revolution. And so we had a break with reality and tradition in the realm of thought, just as the French had it in the realm of society. ... End quote. Marx. Marx's interest in France is indicated by the fact that the first two notebooks begin with a chronology covering nearly 1,000 years of history, from 600 BC to 1589. The historian selected, Christoph Gottlob Heinrich, master of Enlightenment philosophy, was the author of a history of France, for which he drew upon the most serious of primary and secondary sources to provide a detailed presentation of political, military, and diplomatic events from the origins to the beginning of the 19th century. And I don't see anything for Christoph. One second. It looks like this might be a guy who's better known as Friedrich von Römer. Christoph Gottlob Heinrich Friedrich Römer lived from 1794 to 1864 and was a liberal German politician. Back to the text. The history of France is continued in the second Kreuznach notebook, dated, quote, July-August 1843. On the title page, Marx listed the 8 works studied, 2 German authors, 5 French authors, and an English author. With the work of Carl Friedrich Ernst Ludwig, History of the Last 50 Years, published in 1833, Marx begins his study of the history of the French Revolution. And, yeah, I'm not seeing any descriptions of this book. Let me see if there's anything for Carl Friedrich Ernst Ludwig. German Wikipedia says Karl Friedrich Ernst Ludwig was a German publicist and journalist. Back to the text. Footnote. Oh shit, this is a footnote I missed. Heinrich Heine Einleitung zu Karldorf über den Adel. The poet refers to the, quote, philosophical Jacobins of his country and sees in Kant the, quote, Robespierre, in Fichte, quote, the Napoleon, and in Hegel the, quote, Orleans of German philosophy. And there's another footnote that just cites the book that I just read. Cited the Carl Friedrich Ernst Ludwig History of the Last 50 Years. End footnote. From Rousseau's Social Contract, Marx transcribed more than 100 pages. And other no less important readings led Marx to think of the French Revolution not only as a man of his times, but especially as a, quote, a revealer, end quote, of the secret and of the nature of times to come, marked by dominance of capital and of the sovereign state. Wikipedia says The Social Contract is a 1762 French language book by Genevan philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The book theorizes about how to establish legitimate authority in a political community that is, one, compatible with individual freedom in the face of the problems of commercial society, which Rousseau had already identified in his Discourse on Inequality, published in 1755. The social contract helped inspire political reforms or revolutions in Europe, especially in France. The social contract argued against the idea that monarchs were divinely empowered to legislate. Rousseau asserts that only the general will of the people has the right to legislate, for only under the general will can the people be said to obey only themselves and hence be free. Although Rousseau's notion of the general will is subject to much interpretive controversy, it seems to involve a legislature consisting of all adult members of the political community who are restricted to legislating general laws for the common good. And I'm going to read quickly the overview of the book. The epigraph of the work is, "Let us set equal terms for the truce." The stated aim of the social contract is to determine whether there can be a legitimate political authority. Since people's interactions, he saw at this time, seemed to put them in a state of far worse than the good one they were at in the state of nature, even though living in isolation. Rousseau concludes Book 1, Chapter 3 with, quote, "Let us then admit that force does not create right, and that we are obliged to obey only legitimate powers," end quote. Which is to say, the ability to coerce is not a legitimate power. Might does not make right, and the people have no duty to submit to it. A state has no right to enslave a conquered people. Rousseau argues that legitimate authority must be compatible with individual freedom. Such authority can only be compatible with individual freedom if it is consented to, and hence there must be a social contract. However, Rousseau's conception of this social contract was different to that of thinkers before him, such as Grotius, Hobbes, and Pufendorf. For Rousseau, since one's right to freedom is inalienable, the people cannot obligate themselves to obey someone other than themselves. Transferring rights to an authority involved renunciation of freedom and transformed the natural equality of men into subjection. Hence, the only legitimate social contract is a social contract that establishes the people themselves as the rulers. Rousseau refers to the united will of the people as the general will. The general will, to be truly general, must only legislate laws with general form, i.e., laws that apply equally to all. For Rousseau, collective self-rule would increase freedom if the people to whom laws applied were also the ones prescribing them. Rousseau, who objected to extreme wealth inequality, also argued that equality is essential for the attainment of liberty and concluded that legislation ought to preserve equality. Rousseau argues that the sovereign power must be separate from the government, which in Rousseau's terminology refers to the executive power. The division of sovereign from government is necessary because the sovereign cannot deal with particular matters like applications of the law. Doing so would undermine its generality, and therefore damage its legitimacy. Thus the government must remain a separate institution from the sovereign body. When the government exceeds the boundaries set in place by the people, it is the mission of the people to abolish such government and begin anew. Rousseau claims that the size of the territory to be governed often decides the nature of the government. Since a government is only as strong as the people, and this strength is absolute, the larger the territory, the more strength the government must be able to exert over the populace. See also Turner's frontier thesis for the case of America. In his view, a monarchical government is able to wield the most power over the people since it has to devote less power to itself, while a democracy the least. In general, the larger the bureaucracy, the more power required for government discipline. Normally, this relationship requires the state to be an aristocracy or monarchy. When Rousseau uses the word democracy, Rousseau refers to an executive composed of all or most of the people, rather than to representative democracy. Rousseau argues that it is the people themselves, not their representatives, who have supreme power, and that everyone taking part in legislation is a check against abuse of power. In light of the relation between population size and governmental structure, Rousseau argues that, like his native Geneva, Small city-states are the form of the nation in which freedom can best flourish. For states of this size, an elected aristocracy is preferable, and in very large states a benevolent monarch, but even monarchical rule, to be legitimate, must be subordinate to the sovereign rule of law. Okay, so, back to the text. Two works covered in the second Kreuznach notebook helped him to conceive the French Revolution from the twofold perspectives of the French Revolution's causal development and its emancipatory possibilities. Quote, 1. Jacques Cholet by Lou, examen critique de l'ouvrage posthume de M. Laboron de Stel, ayant pour titre Considération sur les principaux événements de la Révolution française. Again, don't know how to pronounce French words, I'm just doing my best. 2. Montesquieu de l'Esprit de Louis, new edition revised, corrected, and considerably expanded by the author T. 1-4, Amsterdam, Leipzig, 1763. The second Kreuznach notebook ends with an index of ideas and reference to the respective pages without mention of the authors. The matter researched covers ancient French history, the French Revolution, Poland, and works of Montesquieu and Rousseau. Just real quick on Montesquieu. Montesquieu lived from 1689 to 1755, is generally referred to as simply as Montesquieu. Was a French judge, man of letters, historian, and political philosopher. Montesquieu is the principal source of the theory of separation of powers, which is implemented in many constitutions throughout the world. Montesquieu is also known for doing more than any other author to secure the place of the word despotism in the political lexicon. Montesquieu anonymously published The Spirit of Law, published in 1748, which was received well in both Great Britain and the American colonies, influencing the founding fathers of the United States in drafting the U.S. Constitution. Back to the text. Thus, Marx had used this collection of passages in his later works. Here are a few key ideas. The Estates General, taxes, demagogues, the Third Estate alone. 1. Estates General, taxes, demagogues, the Third Estate alone is represented in the Assembly of 1357 to 1358. Third Estate, 1383, Assembly of Nobles under Francois the First. 2. War of the Peasants. 3. Parliament, venality of juridical officers. 4. Nobility, the nobles as intermediate body, feudal system. The Progary, the League of Public Welfare. Brittany, the three estates before the Revolution. Private feudal rights. Origin of privileges. Syncretism of privilege. Nobles under the constitutional monarchy. 5. Bureaucracy, civil servants, the mail, and espionage. 6. Constitutional Assembly, fortune and representation, report of the Representative Assembly. To the sovereignty of the people, representation, according to Rousseau. 7. Property and property's consequences, the St. Bartholomew of private property, confiscation of clergy property, and payments of creditors of the state. The maximum in the system of terror, link between property and the system of master and slave. Daru, property is condition for being elected, possession and property. ... End quote. With the third Kreuznach notebook, July 1843, Marx dealt with the history of England, making a compilation of two works, one of which covers the period, quote, from the reign of Henry VII to the present time, end quote. John Russell. He noted in particular the chapters dealing with the influence of the French Revolution on the internal situation of England. France occupies an important place in the fourth notebook, with the passage noted covering the period extending from the Gallo-Romans and the Carolingians in the feudal period up to Philippe the Sixth of Valois, according to the History of France by E.A. Schmidt. A few months later, Marx had an exchange of letters with Rubel, in which the topic was above all Germany, that, quote, 50 years after the French Revolution, end quote, had resumed, quote, all the infamies of the old despotism, end quote, of a Germany that was, quote, absolutely Philistine, end quote, lagging, quote, far behind the French Revolution, which had restored man, end quote. Footnote, Marx to Rubel, Cologne, May 1843. In the same letter, in reference to Napoleon on the Bereshina, watching, quote, the squirming of drowning men, end quote, and exclaiming, quote, look at those toads, end quote, Marx notes, quote, the only thought of despotism is to scorn men. It is a man devoid of man's humanity, ... The despot sees men ever deprived of dignity. Before his eyes and for him, they drown themselves in the muck of vulgar living, just like frogs, end quote. Marx. End footnote. In the eyes of Marx, it was clear that by going to live in Paris, Marx's work of politically engaged author would become part of the tradition of literary criticism that had been exercised by a number of his compatriots who had chosen exile before him, such as Berne and Heine. We all know who Heinrich Heine is, right? The German Jewish poet. And I don't know if I see anything for Berne. Anyway, back to the text. Marx's last reading before Marx's departure are proof to the link of the, quote, great revolution to a, quote, unfettered criticism of the entire established order, end quote. Thus to the, quote, criticism of politics, end quote, by means of the real struggle in which he fully intended to participate. This ambitious objective required the use of serious historiographical sources, and Marx's choice was excellent. Ernest Wilhelm G. Wachsmuth, author of a luminous history of France at the time of the Revolution. Let's see if there's anything for this on the internet. Wikipedia says that Wilhelm Wachsmuth lived from 1784 to 1866 and was a German historian and academic. From 1803 to 1806, Wachsmuth studied philology and theology at the University of Halle, and following graduation, Wilhelm Wachsmuth worked as a teacher at the monastery school in Magdeburg. In 1815, Wilhelm Wachsmuth became an associate professor of philology at Halle. Wilhelm Wachsmuth was professor ordinarius of classical philology at the University of Kiel from 1820 to 1826 and professor ordinarius of history of philosophy at the University of Leipzig from 1826 to 1865. on 7 separate occasions, Wilhelm Wachsmuth was dean to the Faculty of Philosophy at Leipzig, and in 1835/36 he served as university rector. Back to the text. Likewise, he collected many passages from Leopold Ranke on the Restoration in France and the 1830 Charter, and on the, quote, Party of the Revolution, end quote. I know who Ranke is because I'm a historian, but Leopold von Ranke is considered one of the most important figures in modern historiography in terms of like methodology and whatnot. Wikipedia says Leopold von Ranke lived from 1795 to 1886 and was a German historian and a founder of modern source-based history. Leopold von Ranke was able to implement the seminar teaching method in his classroom and focused on archival research and the analysis of historical documents. Building on the methods of the Göttingen School of History, Leopold von Ranke was the first to establish a historical seminar. Leopold von Ranke set the standards for much of later historical writing, introducing such ideas as reliance on primary sources, empiricism, an emphasis on narrative history, and especially international politics, Außenpolitik. Leopold von Ranke was ennobled in 1865 with the addition of a von to his name. Ranke also had a great influence on Western historiography and is considered a symbol of the quality of 19th century German historical studies. Ranke, influenced by Barthold Georg Niebuhr, was very talented in constructing narratives without exceeding the limits of historical evidence. His critics have noted the influence of Lutheranism in guiding his work, especially his belief that God's actions were manifest in the lives of men, and history, a viewpoint that shaped his ideas that the German Empire was a manifestation of God's intent. So that's Leopold von Ranke. Back to the text. In one of Ranke's remarks about the émigrés who had taken advantage of privileges granted by the 1830 Charter, Marx intervenes with a comment, a rare occurrence, ! In a note whose theoretical premises can be found in the manuscript on Hegel's political philosophy. Here are a few significant lines. Quote, under Louis the 18th, the Constitution is a gift of the king, charter granted by the king. Under Louis Philippe, the king is a gift of the Constitution, royalty guaranteed. We can note in general that the transformation of subject into predicate, and of predicate into subject, the inversion of the determining and the determined, always announces a coming revolution, end quote. Marx. Footnote. By changing the moment of the idea of state into subject and ancient political realities into predicate, Hegel expresses, quote, the general character of time. Hegel's political theology, end quote. Marx, end footnote. The restoration of the Bourbons and the July Revolution, even interpreted by a conservative historian like Ranke, offered Marx a field of studies closely linked to his early readings in the realm of the historiography of the French Revolution. Wikipedia says the Second Bourbon Restoration was the period of French history during which the House of Bourbon returned to power after the fall of Napoleon in 1815. The Second Bourbon Restoration lasted until the July Revolution of the 26th of July, 1830. Louis XVIII and Charles X, brothers of the executed King Louis XVI, successively mounted the throne and instituted a conservative government intended to restore the properties, if not all the institutions, of the ancien regime. Exiled supporters of the monarchy returned to France, but were unable to reverse most of the changes made by the French Revolution. Exhausted by the Napoleonic Wars, the nation experienced a period of internal and external peace, stable economic prosperity, and the preliminaries of industrialization. So that's the Bourbon Restoration. And July Revolution, that's 1930, right? Or 1830, that's what I meant to say. And Wikipedia says the July Revolution, the French Revolution of 1830, also known as the July Revolution, Second French Revolution, the Trois Glorieuses, Three Glorious Days, was a second French Revolution after the first in 1789. The 1830 Revolution led to the overthrow of King Charles X, the French Bourbon monarch, and the ascent of Charles' cousin, Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans. I don't know how to say that in French. After 18 precarious years on the throne, Louis-Philippe was overthrown in the French Revolution of 1848. The 1830 Revolution marked a shift from one constitutional monarchy under the restored House of Bourbon to another, the July monarchy, the transition of power from the House of Bourbon to its cadet branch, the House of Orleans, and the replacement of the principle of hereditary right by that of popular sovereignty. Supporters of the Bourbons would be called Legitimists, and supporters of Louis-Philippe were known as Orleanists. In addition, there continued to be Bonapartists supporting the return of Napoleon's descendants. Back to the text. Marx was going to leave Germany for France, a country that, quote, by its own revolutionary initiative and France's social tendencies, was called to serve as model for Germany, end quote. It was in these terms that La Revue Indépendante, a bi-monthly review founded by Pierre Leroux, commented on the appearance in Paris of the Annales de l'Allemagne et de la France. I think that's Annals of Germany in France. I don't know. But let's see who this Pierre Leroux character is. Wikipedia says Pierre Leroux lived from 1797 to 1871, was a French philosopher and political economist. Pierre Leroux was born at Bercy, now a part of Paris, the son of an artisan. Back to the text. Let's see if there's anything for this Annales de l'Allemagne et de la France. I'm not seeing anything. There is nothing astonishing about, back to the text, there is nothing astonishing about the fact that, before going to Paris, Marx did not limit himself to the works of Ranke, and that he consulted authors who could enrich his knowledge in the realm of European political history. And at the end of the fourth Kreuznach notebook, there is a rich collection of passages from two works, the study of which was to enlighten his future work. Quote, John Lingard, History of England Since the First Roman Invasion, translated from English to German, 7 volumes. Erich Gustav Geyer, History of Sweden, translated from the manuscript Hamburg. End quote. Wikipedia says John Lingard was an English Catholic priest and historian, the author of the History of England from the first invasion by the Romans to the accession of Henry VIII, an 8-volume work published in 1819. Lingard was a teacher at the English College of Douai, at the seminary at Crook Hall, and later St. Cuthbert's College. In 1811, he retired to Hornby in Lancashire to continue work on his writings. Though Lingard was accorded no recognition by the British intellectual establishment and is no longer popular as a historian, John Lingard's contribution to historical method came at a critical point in British intellectual history. John Lingard was also a Catholic priest, and a turbulent time for the Church in England makes that contribution all the more interesting. So that's John Lingard. Wikipedia says Eric Gustav Geyer lived from 1783 to 1847. Eric Gustav Geyer was a Swedish writer, historian, poet, romantic critic of political economy, philosopher, and composer. Eric Gustav Geyer's writings served to promote Swedish national romanticism. Eric Gustav Geyer was an influential advocate of conservatism, but switched to liberalism later in life. Back to the text. For his fourth notebook, Marx made an index in 5 columns. Quote, the orders, communes, corporations and domination, municipal power, etc., bourgeoisie. 2. Constitution and administration, feudal system, charges of the court, salaries of bureaucrats, state, king, bureaucrats, parliament, press, human rights, Constitution of 1791. 3. Liberty, equality, Chamber of Deputies, Constitution. 4. Legitimacy, election, representative constitution, sovereignty of the people, House of Commons, English Constitution. 5. Abolition of perpetual loans. In the 5th and last Kreuznach notebook, on the title page, the following titles are listed. Pfister, History of the Germans, Muser, Patriotic Fantasies. 3. The Principle of Heredity, Hamilton, North America, 2 volumes. Niccolo Machiavelli, On the State. Okay, I'm not seeing anything for Pfister. I don't know if this is the right person, but it says Justus Muser lived from 1720 to 1794 and was a German jurist and social theorist best known for his innovative history of Osnabrück, which stressed social and cultural themes. I don't know, maybe it might not be the right person, but it's my best guess. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing to really, I don't know, maybe there's something on this Hamilton guy. No, I'm not saying anything. And then Machiavelli on the State. That probably has something. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for that particular book. Section 7, Parisian Notebook and Ex Libris Marx. Oh shit, there's a footnote here that I missed. Footnote. Among the passages quoted, which cover 40 pages, 2 readings are of particular interest to Marx: the five volumes of the Geschichte des Deutschen by Christian Pfister. So I think I was right about that one. Maybe I wasn't. Let's see. I don't know. No, I didn't see anything for that one, actually. This, Thomas Hamilton, Man and Manners in America. Let's see if there's anything for Thomas Hamilton. The description on Amazon says, no American can fail to be highly entertained by the witty observations of them written by famed Scottish author Thomas Hamilton. Visiting America in 1830, Hamilton was well versed in the history, culture, and famous men of the former colonies, but what Hamilton found was a country that was like no other of the many he had visited. He was bemused by and was slightly appalled by some Americans, but overall he very much enjoyed his visit with a people separated from him only by language. Wasn't he Scottish? What is that? That was a weird description. I don't know. Yeah, Wikipedia just says Thomas Hamilton was a Scottish soldier and author. Back to the text. Among the passages quoted, which cover 40 pages, 2 readings were of particular interest to Marx: the 5 volumes of Geschichte des Deutschen by Christian Pfister, and travel descriptions by the Scotsman Thomas Hamilton, Man and Manners in America, published in 1832, that Marx read in a German translation, and for which a French translation appeared in the same year in Brussels. See Rubel, Introduction to this text. Les Hommes et les Milieux aux États-Unis, edited by Slatkin reprints. Geneva, 1979. Back to the text. Or end footnote. Excuse me. New section, Parisian Notebooks and Ex Libris Marx. Just after moving to Paris, Marx envisages writing a history of the Convention. After completing the reading on the French Revolution begun in Kreuznach. Wikipedia says, the National Convention was the constituent assembly of the Kingdom of France for one day, and the French First Republic for its first 3 years during the French Revolution, following the 2-year National Constituent Assembly and the 1-year Legislative Assembly. Created after the Great Insurrection of the 10th of August 1792, the National Convention was the first French government organized as a republic, abandoning the monarchy altogether. The convention sat as a single-chamber assembly from the 20th of September 1792 to the 26th of October 1795. 4 Brumaire, 4 under the convention's adopted calendar. The convention came about when the Legislative Assembly decreed the provisional suspension of King Louis XVI and the convocation of a national convention to draw up a new constitution with no monarchy. The other major innovation was to decree that deputies to that convention should be elected by all Frenchmen 21 years old or more, domiciled for a year, and living by the product of their labor. The National Convention was, therefore, the first French assembly elected by a suffrage without distinctions of classes. Although the convention lasted until 1795, power was effectively delegated by the convention and concentrated in the small Committee of Public Safety from April 1793. The 8 months from the fall of 1793 to the spring of 1794, when Maximilien Robespierre and his allies dominated the Committee of Public Safety, represent the most radical and bloodiest phase of the revolution, known as the Reign of Terror. After the fall of Robespierre, the convention lasted for another year until a new constitution was written, ushering in the French Directory. Back to the text. In the Jewish question, he had analyzed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen of 1791. He extended this reflection to the text of 1793, the Constitution of Pennsylvania, and that of New Hampshire in order to sharpen his criticism of political rights by affirming that, quote, what are called, quote, rights of man, end quote, parenthesis, quote, rights of man, end quote, distinguished from, quote, rights of citizens, end quote, are nothing other than the rights of a member of civil society, that is, of a selfish man, of man separated from man and from the community, end quote. Quote, the right of man to private property is the right to enjoy his fortune and to use his fortune as he pleases, without being concerned for others, independently of society. It is the right to personal interest, end quote, Marx. The right to liberty is aimed at the, quote, liberty of man as monad, turned in on himself, end quote. It is the, quote, right of narrow-minded individual, of the narrow-minded individual, closed in on himself, end quote. Quote, equality, end quote, is precisely, quote, liberty, thus defined, namely, quote, each man is considered exactly the same as a monad turned in on himself, end quote. With the idea of, quote, security, bourgeois society, quote, does not rise above its selfishness. It is rather the guarantee of its selfishness. Bourgeois society, quote, does not rise above bourgeois society's selfishness. Bourgeois society is rather the guarantee. I fucked something up. With the idea of, quote, security, bourgeois society, quote, does not rise above its selfishness. It is rather the guarantee of its selfishness, end quote. Sorry about that. Marx, the Jewish question. If in the critique of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, Marx revealed the limits of political rights, Marx is far from denying their importance as a means of struggle within the existing, quote, world order. And according to Wikipedia, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, published in 1789, set by France's National Constituent Assembly in 1789, is a human civil rights document from the French Revolution. Inspired by Enlightenment philosophers, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was a core statement of the values of the French Revolution and had a significant impact on the development of popular conceptions of individual liberty and democracy in Europe and worldwide. The Declaration was initially drafted by Marquis de Lafayette with assistance from Thomas Jefferson, but the majority of the final draft came from Abbé C.S. Influenced by the doctrine of natural right, human rights are held to be universal, valid at all times and in every place. It became the basis for a notion of free individuals protected equally by the law. It is included at the beginning of the constitutions of both the Fourth French Republic of 1496 and the Fifth Republic of the Fourth French Republic of 1946 and the Fifth Republic of 1958, and is considered valid as constitutional law. Back to the text. By denouncing the, quote, selfishness of the, quote, political association, whose purpose is supposedly, quote, the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man, end quote, Marx contrasted the ethics of the universal community of emancipated persons with the morality of civil bourgeois society. Of the 400 titles listed in an inventory of Marx's personal library of books and documents that Marx used during his time in Kreuznach, Paris, Brussels, and Cologne between 1843 and 1849, more than 200 deal with the French sphere, the historiography of the Revolution of 1789 and 1830 is represented by some 50 works, some of which are in several volumes. It is necessary to add to this number a series of writings coming from socialist and communist literature, as well as an important section of memoirs of authors such as Beaumarchais, Gregory, Pouchet, Cardinal de Retz, Princess de Lamballe, Duke of Saint-Simon, l'Abbé Terray by Conquerou, etc. I'm going to look some of these people up. Pierre Beaumarchais lived from 1732 to 1799 and was a French polymath. At various times in Beaumarchais' life, Beaumarchais was a watchmaker, inventor, playwright, musician, diplomat, spy, publisher, horticulturalist, arms dealer, satirist, financier, and revolutionary, both French and American. Born a Parisian watchmaker son, Beaumarchais rose in French society and became influential in the court of Louis XV as an inventor and music teacher. Beaumarchais made a number of important business and social contacts, played various roles as a diplomat and spy, and had earned a considerable fortune before a series of costly court battles jeopardized his reputation. An early French supporter of American independence, Beaumarchais lobbied the French government on behalf of the American rebels during the American War of Independence. Beaumarchais oversaw covert aid from the French and Spanish governments to supply arms and financial assistance to the rebels in the years before France's formal entry into the war in 1778. Beaumarchais later struggled to recover money he had personally invested in the scheme. Beaumarchais was also a participant in the early stages of the 1789 French Revolution. Beaumarchais is probably best known for his theatrical works, especially the 3 Figaro plays. Were those made into something by Mozart? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. It might be something else. So that's Beaumarchais. Let's see, Grégoire, maybe, I don't know. Henri Grégoire, often referred to as Abbé Grégoire, lived from 1750 to 1831. Henri Grégoire was a French Catholic priest, constitutional bishop of Blois, and a revolutionary leader. Henri Grégoire was an ardent slavery abolitionist and supporter of universal suffrage. Henri Grégoire was a founding member of the Bureau de Longitude,
the Institut de France, and the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers. Don't know if I'm saying that right. Or métier, might have been. Okay, that's Grégoire. Pouchet. Jacques Pouchet lived from 1758 to 1830. Jacques Pouchet was a French jurist, statistician, and compiler of archives. A monarchist, Jacques Pouchet was a keeper of the archives of the French police. Karl Marx gave a vivid summary of Pouchet's career. Jacques Pouchet, quote, Jacques Pouchet proceeded from belles-lettres to medicine, from medicine to law, from law to administration and police. Pouchet was an inherent of the French Revolution for only a very short time. Pouchet very soon turned to the Royalist Party. Pouchet wound his way very cleverly through the Revolution, sometimes persecuted, sometimes occupied in the Department of Administration and the police, end quote. So that's Pouchet. Cardinal de Retz lived from 1613 to 1679. Cardinal de Retz was a French churchman, writer of memoirs, and agitator in the Fronde. The Florentine banking and noble Gondi family had been introduced to France by Catherine de Medici. Catherine offered Girolamo de Gondi in 1573 the chateau that he made the nucleus of the Château de Saint-Cloud. His hotel in the Faubourg Saint-Germain of Paris became the Hôtel de Condé. In the following generation, the Gondi acquired great estates in Brittany and became connected with the noblest houses of the kingdom. So that's Cardinal del Retz. Marie Theresa Louis of Savoy, or Princess de Lamballe. It might be Lamballe. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Lived from 1749 to 1792 and was a member of the Savoy Carignano cadet branch of the House of Savoy. Princess de Lamballe was married at the age of 17 to Louis Alexandre de Bourbon Penthièvre, Prince de Lamballe, the heir to the greatest fortune in France. After her marriage, which lasted a year, she went to the French royal court and became the confidant of Queen Marie Antoinette. She was murdered in the massacres of September 1792 during the French Revolution. And this Duke of Saint-Simon refers to a Louis de Louis de Rouvroy, Duc de Saint-Simon, who lived from 1675 to 1755. He is a French soldier, diplomat, and memoirist. Saint-Simon was born in Paris at the Hôtel Sauvois, 6 Rue Touraine, demolished in 1876 to make way for the Boulevard Saint-Germain. The family's ducal peerage granted in 1635 to his father Claude de Rouvroy, who lived from 1608 to 1693, served as both the perspective and theme in Saint-Simon's life and writings. The Duke of Saint-Simon was the second and last Duke of Saint-Simon. His enormous memoirs are a classic of French literature, giving the fullest and most lively account of the court at Versailles of Louis XIV and the Regents at the start of Louis XV's reign. Back to the text. I think I said this person's name. I think I put an N in there when there was no N. Coquerel. Yeah, I don't see anything for this person. And I've been here for a while. Moving on. To measure the dimensions of the literary project of which the convention was to be the central theme, it suffices to refer to remarks of Arnold Ruge, who described the behavior of his former companion after the collapse of the Jahrbucher as follows, quote, Marx's excessive sensitivity, manifested itself most often when Marx had worked to the point of making himself ill and had not gone to bed for 3 or even 4 nights, end quote. And he also noted that Marx wanted, quote, to write the history of the convention, and he assembled the materials necessary for this, and adopted quite fruitful points of view, He wants to use his stay in Paris for this work, which is perfectly justified, end quote. Arnold Ruge. The sole concrete trace of this project is a manuscript, an apparently preparatory work among others that have remained unknown until now. It is made up of notes on the memoir of René Lavisseur de la Sarthe. René Lavisseur lived from 1747 to 1834. René Lavisseur was a French surgeon and politician who was a Montagnard deputy in the National Convention during the First French Republic. Back to the text. In 6 pages of a 28-page notebook, Marx wrote in 2 columns, filling the left column with passages quoted in the original language and the right columns with quotations in German translation from a few changes from the French text. The first original quotation suggests the meaning that Marx intended to bestow upon his work. Quote, what is today taken as the madness of a few exalted maniacs was the common feeling of an entire people, and in a certain sense its manner of existing, end quote. Marx. Marx decided to abandon the project of a, quote, history of the convention, end quote. During Marx's, quote, critical review of Hegel's philosophy of right, end quote, Marx had understood that what the Berlin professor meant by, quote, civil society, quote, following the example of the English and the French of the 18th century, end quote, could not be explained by a, quote, general evolution of the human spirit, end quote. To the contrary, the development of social, political, and intellectual life of every human group is rooted in the, quote, economic structure, end quote. In other words, in, quote, the material conditions of life, end quote. Whence the necessity of turning to a study of economics. Marx had been preceded in his new intellectual orientation by Engels, who had published in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher the, quote, brilliant sketch of a critique of economic categories, end quote. One fact confirms the abrupt forsaking by Marx of the work of historian. The 12 pages following the passages from the memoir of Levasseur are filled with quotations from the French edition of Adam Smith's work, The Wealth of Nations, which I should just read. I should read that book. I have not read it. I should. Marx had begun his compilation in Paris in another notebook dating from the spring of 1843, at a time when the study of economics was already guiding his passion for reading, as attested by the notebooks from Paris and from Brussels, where critical commentary accompanies the quotations. The history of the French Revolution was by now an integral part of Marx's thinking, and the, quote, critique of politics, end quote, remained inseparable from the, quote, critique of economics, end quote. It was not by chance that the contract signed with Leska, the publisher, just before his obligatory departure for Paris, covered a work that in its title combined the twofold critique, making it clear that for its author it was a single subject, the same matter. One second. Now I'll see if there's anything for Leska. Probably written toward the beginning of his stay in Brussels in February 1845, the 11 notes condense the fruits of his historical studies since his forced departure from the Rhineland newspaper in March 1843. Marx delineated the thematic scope of the problems to be dealt with in the work promised to the publisher Leska, and it is clear that the French Revolution was at the heart of his reflection. Quote, 1. History of the genesis of the modern state or the French Revolution. The presumptuousness of the political sphere, confusion with the ancient state, revolutionaries in civil society, division of all elements into civil and political beginnings. 2. Proclamation of the rights of man and the constitution of the state, individual freedom and public power, liberty, equality, and unity, the sovereignty of the people. 3. The state and civil society. 4. The representative state and the charter, the constitutional representative state, which is the democratic representative state. 5. The separation of powers, legislative power and executive power. 6. Legislative power and legislative bodies, political clubs. 7. Executive power, centralization and hierarchy, centralization and political civilization, federal system and industrialism, public administration and communal administration. 8. Judicial power and the law. 8.1. Nationality and the people. 9. Political parties. 9.1. The right to vote, the struggle for the abolition of the state and of civil society. End quote. Marx. Conclusion. Final section. The historiography of the French Revolution profoundly marked Marx's political theory. The principal stage of political emancipation, the declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen, while establishing legally the internal dichotomy, or alienation, of modern man and the separation of modern society into classes, was the signal for a social movement dedicated to human and thus total emancipation, to adhere to the view of integral liberation, with as a result the appearance of the, quote, well-rounded, allseitig individual, end quote, implied from Marx's adherence to the revolution, having hollowed the rights to free expression, and free association, quote, bourgeois conquest, necessary condition for an equally important and significant conquest. The frequenting of French socialist literature in the working class environment of Paris enriched Marx's humanist culture, acquired for the most part thanks to his earlier intellectual masters, such as Epicurus, Lucretius, Gassendi, and Spinoza, with a new dimension, that of a utopia implicitly understood as an ethic of emancipation of the, quote, immense majority, end quote, whose disciple had drawn the substantial elements from the teachings of William Godwin, Robert Owen, of Charles Fourier, Pierre Leroux, and Babeuf. In thinking of Kant, Marx was tempted to discover in the tissue of revolutionary history the secret called, quote, law, end quote, of a movement of emancipation, which in the final analysis is in keeping with the becoming aware of a, quote, categorical imperative, end quote. The political activity of Marx, theoretician of the capitalist manner of production, and of, quote, scientific socialism, was combined with a permanent combat against the three principal forms of negation of the Charter of the Rights of Man: Prussian absolutism, Russian Tsarism, and French Bonapartism. As paradoxical as it might seem, Marx, the, quote, communist, had to struggle throughout his career as a man of science and as political militant in order to have his, quote, bourgeois, end quote, claims triumph. In other words, the ideals proclaimed by the fundamental charter of liberal democracy, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Marx's combat as spokesman for freedom of the press and respect for common law, his role as militant in the League of Communists, his activity as leading member and leader of the International Working Men's Association, accompanied and illustrated the laborious gestation of a scientific work that, despite its incomplete nature, makes of Marx, thinker of the French Revolution, a pioneer in political theory, and one of the most astute critics of the wiles of politics. Translated by R. Scott Walker. And I don't know if this has had a year on it. I don't know. I don't think I saw a year, but I'll have to figure that out later. Thank you so much for listening.